While Linda Arndt ran into the first Ramsey roadblock, while she was sort of stuck, two other officers were following a lead the Ramseys had given them, and were making a lot more progress. This lead would take them, these investigators, to the pews. The housekeeper, though distressed, allowed herself to be separated from her husband that night, that's the night of December 26th, and questioned. Linda's husband, Merv, was also questioned. Now let's examine Lauren Schiller's review of Merv's various cameos in the Ramsey narrative.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Below are 6 shocking insights related to the housekeeper's husband. Number 1, the pews were questioned for 3 hours on December 26th. What's interesting to note now is not only how different the police treat the wealthy and well-to-do John and Patsy compared to the blue-collar, rough-around-the-edges Linda and Merv, but also how they treat the police. By nightfall on December 26th, John has already lawyered up. Linda and Merv haven't. They're suspects. Why are they talking to the cops? Why aren't they lawyering up? Well, perhaps because they have nothing to hide. Through Schiller's narrative, it's very interesting to juxtapose what is going on at pretty much the same time but different places in Boulder. So he notes, around 7 p.m., John Ramsey went for a walk with John Fernie and Dr. Buffe, JonBenet's physician. That's what John's doing on the night of the murder. He's going for a walk with Dr. Buffe, and the doctor had brought over some medication for Patsy. When they returned a half hour later, Ramsey asked Bynum to represent him. So after this walk with the doctor, John kind of makes up his mind and he takes quite drastic action. One does wonder what was discussed during that walk. And at the time, he was also saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," telling his friends over and over. What's that all about? And then around about the same time, John returning from this walk and lawyering up on the day after Christmas, just after 8 p.m., he was left alone to take a walk in the nearby foothills. So John's going for a walk, and then earlier at 7 p.m., Detectives Fred Patterson and Greg Idler knocked on the door of the Ramsey's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh. By the way, Fred Patterson was the first officer who briefly interviewed Burke Ramsey at the Whites. It could also have been at the Fernies. Anyway, so Patterson knocks on the door. When the housekeeper saw the police, her first thought was something had happened to one of her own children. And so the police asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table, and then they took her husband, Merv, downstairs to the TV room. They were prepared to be separated, and he wasn't allowed to leave the room, even to get a beer, unless an officer accompanied him. Just think about how different these people are being treated. In the kitchen, the police told the housekeeper that JonBenet had been murdered. She screamed and couldn't stop shaking. Kind of a similar reaction in a way to Patsy. After Hoffman Pugh settled down, they asked her to print some words on a sheet of paper. Mr. Ramsey, attaché, beheaded, and the number 118,000. But Linda was too upset to write. Upon hearing the words, she assumed that JonBenet had been beheaded, and why wouldn't she? She also figured that she and her husband were suspects, and she was right. The police spent 3 hours talking to the Pews that night. And one of the questions asked was, had Linda ever witnessed any signs of SA in the Ramsey household? Had JonBenet ever wet the bed? Had Linda seen anything unusual on the child's bed or on anyone else's bed? And that brings us to number 2. The cops suspected SA on day 1. And guess what? They were right. One of the questions the cops asked Linda, possibly when they felt more reassured that Linda as a suspect was a long shot, and Merv an even longer shot, was whether Linda had observed any SA. Remember, this is December 26th, before the autopsy. They also asked if Linda had ever seen anything unusual on the child's bed, and of course the answer was yes. Besides bedwetting virtually on a nightly basis, while balls of dung sometimes made an appearance. I think one's also got to wonder, when the police saw the housekeeper's reaction to what she was told, did that ring true to them? And what do you think the answer is to that? Number 3, the Pews didn't have an alibi. Now, the crazy thing about this is they could have pulled an Amanda Knox and simply provided alibis for one another. Who would have known any better? Instead, they acknowledged that they slept separately and so technically didn't have an alibi. The crazy part about this is, well, maybe the housekeeper didn't have an ironclad alibi. Maybe Merv doesn't have an ironclad alibi, but none of the Ramseys do. Not only are all 3 of them at the scene, but they are sort of all over the scene. You know, there's no confirmation, no evidence that the housekeeper or Merv was at the scene. Number 4, the Pews were fingerprinted before the Ramseys. That's also quite incredible if you think about it. When Schiller refers to the cops returning the next day, I think he means December 27th. If that's true, then Linda and Merv were fingerprinted even before Patsy, even before John, even before Burke. Patsy, John, and Burke were processed on the 28th. That's the same day Patsy's sister staged what Steve Thomas described as a one-person raid of the crime scene. The housekeeper also didn't try to hide the fact that she needed money and that she'd asked Patsy for money. According to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Hoffman Pugh confirmed for the police that the day after the Ramseys' December 23rd Christmas party, so obviously December 24th, she had called Patsy, the housekeeper had phoned Patsy and asked for $2,000 that she desperately needed to pay the rent. Now, if Patsy had said, yes, I'll give it to you, when do you think the housekeeper would have gotten it? Well, the next time she came to the house, which was supposed to be when the Ramseys were away, and likely to be, well, when was it? The 27th, I think. And so an interesting question is, did Patsy ever write a check? And was a check ever found at the Ramsey residence? In the basement TV room, Merv Pugh told the police that the previous night he had fallen asleep on the couch in front of the TV. There's also additional confirmation that he's a TV addict. By the way, this whole thing about his interest in cowboy films comes up in his obituary. And he also said that Linda had said she went to sleep upstairs in their room. That was his story for where Linda was. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? This morning, Pugh said he had been up at about 5 a.m. and the family had left the house at about 10 p.m. I think the more important question to ask around this whole idea of whether they had an alibi is, where were they the night before? Because, you know, there's this whole idea from the Ramseys that someone was in the house when they went to the dinner party, right? And so on Christmas night, someone was in the house for an extended period of time, perhaps as much as 3 to 4 hours. So where was Hoffman Pugh during that time? Where was her husband during that time? And I think the answer to that is likely very clear. Well, they were both at home and they were both together. You see how interesting it is when you go down some of these pathways and just think them through. Number 5, Merv and Linda are important witnesses regarding the broken window myth. Now, this is so interesting. Neither Merv nor Linda noticed John's broken window when they were in the basement. It was supposed to have been broken in the summer, remember, and stayed broken for around 6 months. Well, strange, no one seemed to know about it until the night of December 26th. And I thought the intruder used a key to get in. What happened to that? Now they're getting in through a broken window. Back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. There's an interesting appearance of Susan Stein at this juncture. Patsy sees her friend Susan Stein at the Fernie's house later that day. And Patsy kept saying, "Who would do this to my baby?" And Susan said, "I don't know." It's interesting that people overheard this. The police interviewed Linda Hoffman Pugh for a second time on Friday, December 26th, and they came with a tape recorder. So that's not even something that the Ramseys did. They weren't recorded with a tape recorder. And I think the fact that they brought a tape recorder was because the housekeeper consented to be recorded when she was being questioned. The Ramseys housekeeper told the police that the day after Thanksgiving, she and her daughter Ariana and her husband were at the Ramseys house washing the windows and getting the house ready for Christmas. That is 3 people from that family that's inside the house and they're all washing windows. Schiller goes on to note in his narrative, Hoffman Pugh brought the Christmas decorations in from the garage, but couldn't find the artificial trees that had been brought to the house from the Access Graphics storage hangar. Well, guess where those were? In the basement, in the wine cellar. Number 6, Linda, her husband, and Ariana cleaned the windows. I wish they could have been more specific about which windows, but certainly if they cleaned the basement windows, then they absolutely had to have seen it was broken or indeed that it wasn't. Also, I don't know if you would have all of these people come in to clean windows if you, surely you would say, well, I need you to clean all the windows. Think about the kind of stickler for detail that Patsy was and wanting to impress everyone. Wouldn't she want all the windows sparkly clean in the house? But the question does remain, did they wash the basement windows after Thanksgiving? And I suppose Ariana could answer this particular question, Linda Hoffman Pugh's daughter. The narrative goes on to note there should have been a tree for the playroom and one for each of the 5 bedrooms. That's a total of, I guess, 6 trees plus the tree in the lounge. That's 7. Hoffman Pugh even checked the basement, but she couldn't find them. So she continued cleaning the windows. And so she was looking for trees in the basement while they were actually in the wine cellar room. Even though they were there and she checked, she couldn't find them. After they had washed the windows, Hoffman Pugh and her daughter started searching the house for the missing trees. She saw a closed door in the basement just past the boiler room. This is the wine cellar, which she had never noticed before. She tried to open the door, but it was stuck shut, apparently from a recent painting. She pulled at it hard, and finally the door opened. So that's also an interesting question. Who painted the wine cellar at that sort of late date? Because that person would also be very familiar with that room, given the time that this happened. Feeling around in the dark, she found a light switch on the wall to her right. Now, I think this is feeling around in the dark in the day. That's something similar to what Fleet White did. And of course, I don't think he could find the light switch. When she turned the light on, what did she see? Well, the room was full of trees, some still covered with the previous year's decorations. There was also replicas of Burke's model airplanes. This is in that basement wine cellar, which I think is quite interesting. And then also John Andrews' cowboy hats, his boots, and red scarves. The next day, the housekeeper had her older daughter, Tina, that's another member of the housekeeper's family, and her son-in-law, Mike, and her husband, Merv, take all the trees upstairs and place them in their proper rooms. Then the police asked the housekeeper, did you close the door to that storage room securely? Well, she didn't know. She couldn't remember. In other words, the question is, who latched the door? Did you latch that door? Another question I could have asked her is, were you the last person in that room, or was your husband? And she said she didn't know because she didn't even know what the room looked like empty because she wasn't the last person to leave, she said. And then the police asked if she'd seen a broken window in the basement or had ever cleaned up broken glass from a broken window. Now, you'd think the only person that is really a candidate for cleaning broken glass in this house would be the housekeeper. Patsy wouldn't do it. And she said, well, no, I can't recall anything like that. So one of the main reasons we've gone down this path is because I wanted to show you, long before the Ramseys deigned to sit down with the cops for their first formal interview, when that would be recorded. And that only happened on the last day of April 1997, 4 months later. The Pews, both of them, had already been interviewed 3 times, I think, within the first week of the incident. And it's also clear by this 3rd session of questioning, the essay narrative was still top of mind. Hence the cops wanting to know whether Linda had changed JonBenet's sheets and also asking about anything found in the sheets. Do you think the sheets were changed since the Monday before Christmas? Well, Carol McKinley's source said the bed stank of ammonia. It was so strong it could knock you out, were the words of that source. And so the answer is obviously no. And the implications of this are, 1, Patsy was a terrible housekeeper, but also 2, she wasn't taking terribly good care of her beauty queen child, certainly not the bed aspect and the sleeping aspect, was she? I'm talking about towards the very end. In the end, Merv, can you see, is an important witness. Besides Linda and her daughter Ariana, and I guess even Tina. How so? Well, they raised doubt about the broken window story and ultimately the intruder theory. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you guys next time.